When we talk about rotation in the transverse plane, on average, and this would just be an average individual, which really doesn't exist for the hip, but we're looking at about 45 degrees of external rotation, about 35 degrees of internal rotation. So I flexed my hip to 90 degrees, and you can see the yellow dot, and what's traveling on the superior side of that yellow dot has actually become an internal rotator. When we're talking about extension, generally about 15 to 25 degrees of extra extension can occur from an average or typical lordosis at a shorter muscle length. And even though my overall slope of stiffness is the same, I'm just going to perceive more stiffness at a shorter length. So when I extend the knee against this, I'm actually going to be fighting the own resistance from my hamstring as I extend the knee, just like we reviewed before. And we're going to use the hip flexor test, the modified Thomas test, as a proxy for this. Whereas the individual with greater hip flexor stiffness, I'm going to lower the limb, but I might actually feel passive resistance, or if I were to even let this go, and I can walk away from this individual and their leg will just be hanging 30 degrees from full hip extension. And when we talk about relative flexibility, it's generally we're talking about excessive flexibility in one area, one direction or multiple directions. So we're going to talk about interjoint relative flexibility, just the relative flexibility between two joints. And we're going to talk about the lumbar spine and hip. And you can imagine as hip flexion occurs, my lumbar spine extensors have to be stiff enough. And in this case, they're equally stiff, so I get no motion up my lumbar spine when the hip flexes here. And so now every time I flex my hip, the stiffness of the hip muscles is greater than the stiffness of the lumbar extensors. And so what I induce is, as I begin to flex the hip, I begin to induce lumbar motion every time I flex my hip. And what happens is you extend the knee actively, and you actually induce lumbar flexion every time you extend the knee, even with active contraction of the quadriceps. So let's talk about how the relatively less flexion at the hip or less or greater stiffness of the musculature surrounding the hip can start causing more relative interjoint flexibility of the lumbar spine. I'm in 90 degrees of hip flexion. I've maintained all of my lumbar extension. So the individual on the right now, they have significantly stiffer posterior hip musculature and hamstring musculature than the lumbar spine. And you can notice immediately the lumbar spine begins to move into flexion as they begin to squat, and then they get lower in the motion. So instead of the individual on the left, where I'm just able to flex my lumbar spine, I get flexion with rotation of my lumbar spine. So basically a lack of right hip flexion or decreased right hip flexion due to greater stiffness of the right hip extensors has now resulted in greater relative interjoint flexibility, greater lumbar spine flexion and rotation. And so I extend the hip as in gait, for example, and I get no motion of my lumbar spine when my hip extends. So they found if you have relative stiffness of the hip flexors, such as the rect fem, when you do active knee flexion or knee flexion prone, you will get greater earlier lumbar extension. So, and here you might get 15 degrees of lumbar flexion, 60 degrees of hip flexion. I have very little function or stiffness of the primary muscles that prevent rotation of my lumbar spine, where I have a lot of stiffness of this right TFL. So as I begin to move the pelvis into left rotation, which is relative right hip external rotation, eventually the TFL stiffness may begin to limit just the rotational movement. And so really what we've gone through is relative muscle stiffness cause relative interjoint flexibility between the hip and the spine.